Kate Weaver is the leader of, or one of the leaders of this CCAPS project that you've heard some things about. The flyers are out there. There's a lot to this, a pretty amazing, huge thing at the LBJ School at the University of Texas in their Strauss Center. She has been a research fellow at Brookings. She got her PhD in political science at University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I hear she has a big birthday coming up soon. She works on the culture, behavior, and reform of international financial institutions, foremost the World Bank and the IMF. She has 4 books, and some of them are about the World Bank. And they're pretty spicy, right? I'm trying to get people to read your stuff. Christian Peratsakis is a research assistant, and he's a master's student at University of Texas. He's a research fellow with Aid Data. He previously went to William and Mary, where he was one of my most trusted and hardworking research assistants, really an extraordinary young man. And he works on aid effectiveness and transparency, innovations in development financing and practices, climate finance, and emerging donors. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks, Timon, I think. Okay, so I want to give you a bit of context about what we're doing. The CCAPS program is a 5-year, multi-million-dollar grant from, of all places, the U.S. Department of Defense. So I know we've talked a lot about stakeholders in today's conversation and who cares about tracking aid. And actually, you might be surprised to find that the U.S. Department of Defense is very interested in tracking climate aid. Overall, the CCAPS research program is divided into 4 areas. The first is developing maps of complex vulnerability across the continent of Africa. The second is to understand the relationship between climate change and patterns of conflicts and governance instability. And then finally, our last component is looking at international aid for climate change adaptation and mitigation, and trying to develop mechanisms for tracking that aid and geomapping it so we can put that into visualized form that's very useful for policymakers, for civil society groups, and for analysts. So overall, we have several aid tracking objectives, and here's where we scale it up from individual organizations' initiatives to trying to come up with a system that allows us to track climate-related aid across organizations. So the first thing we do is we actually geocode all aid projects. This is all donors, all sectors at the subnational level. This is actually why we've partnered with Development Gateway and Aid Data, because they've done groundbreaking work on this subject. What we discovered, though, earlier in the process is that you can't geocode something for which you have very little data. So if you wanted to describe our entire data process, it comes down into 5 parts. And the first part is chasing the data, right? So we're definitely at the point of the data drought, to mix metaphors. And we had to figure out how we're going to actually gather the data that would give us the information necessary to geocode. And that actually meant that we had to get beyond what was readily available in the OECD creditor reporting system, where you can find rich information on project descriptions, but those descriptions were relatively short and certainly didn't give you the kind of longitudinal and latitudinal data you would need to map something, nor did it give you enough information to understand whether or not a project was actually doing any kind of activity that was relevant for climate change adaptation or mitigation, because that is not a sector that is traditionally recorded within the aid reporting systems. So the first thing we had to do is figure out, how do we get better project documentation from donors? We naively thought about a year ago, well, we'll just check all their websites, only to find out that the only donor that has project information relevant to Africa on their websites was the World Bank. So we love the World Bank, because there it all was on their website. For the rest, we had to reach out bilaterally and figure out how we could find this project documentation. When we finally figured out the best route was to actually tackle it through a country case study, where we knew we could get access to donors. And we had the advantage of working with Development Gateway again, who has the aid management platform. And they invited us to come along to one of their meetings and talk to the recipient partners. And it turns out Malawi is really on the cutting edge in terms of using the aid management platform to record incoming aid flows from all donors. They even have the donors report on a monthly basis. So it's timely, rich information that we could access. And they welcomed us to come in and geocode the information. but it also meant that we had to go and get the information. So we have a couple students in the room. This gives you sort of the human side of all this data stuff. I have Dylan and Sarah in the room. They and two other of our students traipsed off to the long way in February and spent about 2 weeks scanning documents in a small office in the Ministry of Finance in Malawi. But at the end of the day, what we end up after many trips is we actually collected all the documents for 800 active donor projects in Malawi across 29 donors. And we geomapped this over the summer, hard work of interns sitting in the conference room of Development Gateway. And it's going to be done in the Esri platform that you've already been exposed to, which allows you to zoom in and out on the dots on the map to get really interesting information about what's going on in a project. So after we've geocoded all that, what we're trying to do now is to identify, of that universe of aid in Malawi, which of the projects are doing climate-related activities. And that involves developing a sophisticated climate tracking system and a coding system for this purpose. Once we're done with this, and we'll show you a little bit of our initial work on that, what we think we can do with this is overlay the climate aid maps on top of other maps that show climate vulnerability. And then we can start to ask the questions that we really want to know the answers to, such as, where is the aid that's addressing adaptation needs in Malawi? Is it targeting the areas most in need? And then we can go out in the field in the fourth stage of our project with all these innovative technologies like crowdsourcing and do the ground truthing and be able to answer things such as, is the aid actually hitting the ground? And what is that aid actually doing? So we have been thinking very much about the end use of all of this, but it's a step-by-step process of overcoming the data drought and getting to the usable data deluge.
So as Timmons set up at the beginning of the panel, we're talking about a lot of money here. But as Kate and Timmons also discussed, we're talking about an issue of transparency and an issue of aid effectiveness. So I'm just going to touch very briefly on how this relates back to the transparency, and Kate will go into a little bit more depth about the actual effectiveness. So I think we can arguably all agree that climate change has sort of exploded onto the development scene. It now commands much of the discourse in many ways, and it has the potential to shift billions of dollars in funding. And so this has resulted in a twofold problem. The first is, as Kate was mentioning, a data drought. But I want to take that a step forward, and it's also a flood of data. So you are faced with a lot of information that's coming out at the same time. It's very fragmented. There's not a lot of context in how it fits into the broader development situation. That's starting to emerge, but it hasn't been there before. And then this data, as a result, is not usable for a climate and a non-climate audience. They're not really speaking to each other. So as a result of that, you have the second part of the problem, which is you are not getting good or useful data that's being produced by people that are working on it, either from a scientific perspective or from a more development perspective, as we are. And I think this is best exemplified in the coding methodologies and the strategies and the conceptualizations that existed before. As Timmons alluded to in the introduction, in 2009, we partnered with DFID to try and look at their 2008-2009 aid portfolio. And we found that there were 19 different coding methodologies at the time as to how you can identify foreign aid for climate change. But what we found is, while these were all very diverse, it broke down into a very simplistic and often too confined approach. It was, first you looked at an aid project. Is it climate or is it not? Well, if it was not climate, you stopped. If it was climate, then it was the easy distinction, is it mitigation or is it adaptation? Or we thought it was easy at first. But then once you actually decide that it is adaptation, it is climate, now you have the more difficult task, as Timmons outlined, as to are you going to go with a narrow or a broad definition of adaptation? And I think that relates to the larger development community in the sense that you're talking about 3% of the aid or 80% of aid. So if you give these numbers to donors or to recipient countries or to users on the ground, what does that mean to them? That gives them no insight as to how they can prepare for the future. So having built off of several years of looking at these different strategies and having read through probably thousands of project documents, we started to think of new ways. And what's nice is that the CCAPS aid data methodology is very similar to the World Bank's methodology, which is very similar to how Tom and the African Development Bank are looking at it. So we're starting to see convergence of methodologies. We may be going about it a little bit differently in practice, but the overall conceptualization is starting to come together. So what we've come up with is an adaptation spectrum. I think we can all agree that in some form or another, development can help people adapt in one way or another. It's just a question of how much does it help people adapt, or does it, in effect, help people not help people adapt and actually do a negative effect. So what we've decided is that we're going to place it on a spectrum with 4 different poles. The first is ambiguous development, which is a category that lumps aid projects in which you're unsure of its climate orientation, you know for sure that it has no climate orientation, or it may even be maladaptive. The general development is one that we assume is going to be a very broad and all-encompassing categorization. And this is looking at anything that makes people increase their well-being. This can include anything within the education sector or the health sector, so it's quite large. And then the difference between general development and capacity development is increasing resilience versus increasing resilience to climate change rather than just simply increasing well-being. And then our final pole is climate-oriented, which, like capacity development, is increasing resilience, but with a clear motivation or intention to the climate shocks or risks. So, just very briefly to go into our coding procedure, and I'm trying not to bore you, but I will tie it back to some of the larger issues of today. As Kate alluded to already, we had to go through this painstaking process of acquiring the project documents. Then what we did was we've had, with the great help of Aid Data, their team has activity coded all these project documents. And what activity coding is, it's a complementary effort to the OECD's sector and purpose codes to make it more granular. And once we then take those activity codes, and we preset them to a spot on the spectrum. So now our coders actually read the documents. They think about the activities that were coded by Aid Data's RAs, and then they evaluate them based on the climate spectrum. If they think that it fits well within it, they leave it as is. Otherwise, they have the ability to adjust it and explain why they change it from its normal position on the spectrum. After assessing the activities, projects themselves are assessed at the overall level. And what this allows us to do is it allows us to because we have the access to the project documents, it allows us to take it a step further and actually do a content analysis. So in the past, when using previous data sources, we were very limited to the descriptions and the understandings of what the projects were. But now we can find what is climate spectrum. We can find are they actually addressing climate change in contexts that we weren't able to before.
Okay, you can go ahead and go next. So we have preliminary results of the pilot project in Malawi, and I know you've been seeing a lot of Malawi maps. This is all work tied together. In general, this screen actually shows you the kind of information that we're capturing in our coding system. By and large, it's really useful from an analytical point of view because we're also able to compare what we find in our coding process via the Rio marker. So it's a way of comparing different data sets. We also have the coders have open fields for making comments. They can address whether that adaptation is reactionary or precautionary, and also if it has an indirect or direct effect, which I will spare you the details in the sake of time. By and large, what we've done, we've gone ahead and coded using this system the African Development Bank and World Bank development projects in Malawi. And I don't know if you can see them on the screen there, but you can see by and large where those projects are, broadly and narrowly defined. So the general development projects, which is that broader category of adaptation, are in the triangles, green for African Development Bank, blue for the World Bank. The squares are actually the more narrowly defined, which is capacity development or climate-oriented project. We think the utility of this is actually what it can tell us in terms of where the aid actually is and whether or not it's targeting areas of need. So in this map, what you see are those projects laid on top of a climate vulnerability map produced by the part of the CCAPS team that's doing this vulnerability mapping. And Malawi itself is fortunately not the most vulnerable country in Africa, but even now we begin to see whether or not the more narrowly defined climate projects are lining up with the areas most in need. Now, as Mike quite correctly pointed out in the last session, there's not a lot we can actually learn just from looking at this map, but I think what we can actually do with this is start to ask the right questions about climate aid and climate vulnerability in the country. And so this is work that literally was produced about 72 hours ago, so it's that new. But as we sort of refine our methodology and refine the maps, where this data is going is into a very sophisticated data dashboard that CCAPS is producing that allows you to actually import different data, mash it up in different data sets, overlay different maps, and do some really useful analytical things. But at the end of it, we're also very concerned about transparency and information for whom. So far, we've been really sort of producing things for high-end analytical users. But of course, in some sense, our client is the government of Malawi. They're the ones that is very interested in having their aid mapped and very interested in knowing where the climate aid is specifically as they move forward in planning for their national adaptation programs of action and so forth. So the data visualization here is absolutely key, because it sort of is a shortcut for understanding sort of where the aid actually is and what it's doing. We also think in the same sense this data can be very useful for societies. There is a tremendous network of climate change-oriented civil society organizations and NGOs in Malawi who would be very interested in knowing where the development assistance is and what it's doing with respect to climate aid. Our maps will allow them to roll over the dots and get very specific information about those projects. And we think that this will be very useful in terms of coordination and communication between those various stakeholders. Now, whether or not they will actually use that data is something we do not yet know. But what we're hoping to do is produce it in many different forms and then talk to the users and then refine that sort of those data dashboards to meet their user needs. So that's where we are with the system. We're still in the beginning, but our hope is that we're going to scale this up to other countries if we can prove that this works, the demonstration effect in Malawi. Thanks.